In the humid afternoon haze of August 4th, 2020, a strange plume of smoke began rising from Beirut's port. From rooftops and balconies, residents squinted into the sun, curious but calm. What they couldn't see, what no one could have imagined, was the 2,750 tons of volatile ammonium nitrate quietly seething beneath the surface of Warehouse 12. At 6:07 p.m. the silence was shattered. A deafening roar split the city in half. The air ignited and an inferno bloomed, orange and furious, swallowing the horizon. Then came the shockwave. A blinding pulse of energy ripped outward, flattening concrete, bending steel, and flinging human bodies like paper in a storm. In mere seconds, buildings crumbled, windows shattered across the city, and the lives of hundreds of thousands changed forever. It looked like a war zone, but there were no fighter jets, no bombs dropped from above. The weapon was negligence. This is the story of the 2020 Beirut explosion. An urban detonation so massive and so violent that it was heard more than 150 miles away. A disaster born not from war or terrorism, but from bureaucratic apathy and silent, deadly ignorance. This wasn't just an accident, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And it did. As the dust settled, what emerged was a city torn open, not only by physical force, but by the gaping wounds of trust betrayed and warnings ignored. Survivors would dig with their bare hands, searching for loved ones buried beneath collapsed homes. Entire families disappeared in an instant, erased by a blast that rivaled a nuclear detonation in sheer force. In the days that followed, images from Beirut flooded the world. A mushroom cloud towered above a shattered port. Cars were hurled like toys. Apartment buildings exposed their private interiors like open caskets. The haunting sound of broken glass crackled beneath every step. But beyond the images were stories, unimaginable, gut-wrenching stories, of survival, of horror, and of those who vanished. But how did this happen? How does an industrial quantity of high explosive material sit, virtually unguarded, in the heart of a populated city for years? Who allowed it? And why, even now, do so many questions remain unanswered? Through survivor accounts and haunting analysis, we unravel the anatomy of a disaster. Not a freak accident. A man-made tragedy of breathtaking scale. Beirut has long been a city of resilience, scarred by war, shaped by conflict, but forever standing. Yet nothing could have prepared it for this. Nothing could have warned the people of Karantina, of Gemaize, of the harbour workers and hospital staff, that a white-hot cloud of death was already ticking down behind the rusted doors of Warehouse 12. This is not just a story of fire and ruin. It's a story of silence, of records misplaced, of leaders who failed to lead, of a city left to bleed in broad daylight. And it's a story you won't forget. Long before the explosion turned Beirut's skyline into a graveyard of collapsed concrete, the seeds of disaster were quietly sown in the depths of its harbourside warehouses. But to understand how such a catastrophe could occur, one must first understand the place it struck. Beirut, Lebanon's beating heart. Perched on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, Beirut is a city carved by contradiction. Known as the Paris of the Middle East, its architecture is a patchwork of French colonial grandeur, 1970s modernism, and post-war reconstruction. It is both beautiful and broken, war-torn yet vibrant, a cultural hub built atop centuries of upheaval, trade, and survival. By 2020, Beirut was a city already teetering on the edge. Decades of political dysfunction, economic turmoil, and regional instability had left the Lebanese people weary and angry. Inflation had swallowed wages. The local currency was in freefall. Banks froze withdrawals. Against this backdrop of frustration and despair stood the port of Beirut, a vital artery through which much of Lebanon's imports and exports flowed. It was not just a hub of commerce, it was the lifeblood of a nation that depended heavily on foreign goods. But the port also hid something far more volatile than crates of flour and containers of electronics. Back in 2013, a decrepit Moldovan-flagged cargo ship named the Rosas limped into port. On board was an alarming cargo: 2,750 metric tons of ammonium nitrate, an industrial chemical used in agriculture as fertilizer, and, under the right conditions, as an explosive. The ship was impounded for failing safety checks. Its Russian owner abandoned it, and its deadly cargo was confiscated and stored temporarily in the warehouse. Years passed. There were no warning signs outside the building, no guards, no regular inspections. Letters were sent to judges, to customs officials, to politicians, pleased to remove or properly secure the materials. All were met with silence. The ammonium nitrate simply sat there, baking in the Mediterranean sun year after year. Meanwhile, just beyond the port's rusted fences, the people of Beirut carried on with their lives. Children walked to school beneath cranes and shipping containers. Workers commuted past docked freighters and smoke-belching trucks. Couples dined in trendy rooftop bars just a few hundred meters from one of the largest ticking time bombs in the world. The area closest to the warehouse, Karantina, was one of the city's poorest districts. A tightly packed neighborhood of aging apartment blocks and crowded tenements. It housed working-class families, day laborers, and Syrian refugees. It was a place where life was lived on the margins, and it would be the first to bear the full brunt of what was coming. Even as the government changed hands and factions traded power in the marble halls of Parliament, no one seemed willing to take responsibility for the shipment. It became a bureaucratic ghost. Everyone's problem and no one's fault. The chemicals degraded and the storage conditions worsened. Beirut was, in many ways, already a city holding its breath, a city hardened by civil war, bombings, and foreign occupations. But the explosion that would erupt from its own harbor would be unlike anything it had faced before, not just in scale, but in its cruel irony. It wasn't a bomb planted by enemies. It wasn't an act of terror. It was a preventable disaster, born not of malice, but of staggering indifference. And so the stage was set. A volatile chemical stockpile left in a crumbling shed, a city wrapped in political paralysis, and a population suffering in silence. The only thing missing was a spark. At approximately 5:40 p.m. local time in Beirut, smoke began rising from the port. It was dark and steady, curling upward into the hot summer sky. People noticed immediately. Drivers slowed their cars, shopkeepers stepped outside, and people filmed with their phone. No one knew what was burning, but everyone wanted to see. By 5:43 p.m. the smoke had thickened. Bright flashes flickered deep inside the warehouse, brief bursts of red and orange that lit up like distant fireworks. There were popping sounds, sharp and rhythmic. Some thought it was ammunition. Others guessed firecrackers. A few people laughed nervously as they filmed, unaware that they were capturing their final moments. At 5:45 p.m., the tone shifted. The warehouse released a low, groaning sound, a metallic strain like something enormous cracking under pressure. It lasted only a few seconds. Then came silence. A moment of stillness, eerie and absolute. And then, the blast. The explosion that followed wasn't just loud, it was devastating beyond comprehension. The people in the immediate area were vaporized by the shockwave, gone before sound could even reach them. In the milliseconds after the chemicals ignited, the force of the explosion didn't just destroy, It erased the very outline of what once existed. Bodies, buildings, even the air itself, snuffed out in a flash of white heat and pressure. The port warehouse didn't collapse so much as it ceased to be. Those inside were never recovered, not lost, but utterly erased. Steel twisted like thread, concrete blasted into dust, and human beings were reduced to fragments and smoke, their last moments swallowed by heat and pressure so intense it left behind nothing at all. Further out, the horror mutated. Shards of shattered glass from high-rises rained down like razor hail, slicing through victims with surgical cruelty. People who had just stepped onto balconies found themselves flung across rooms, impaled by debris, or buried under collapsed ceilings. In a split second, vibrant neighbourhoods were transformed into dust-choked mazes of screaming, searching, and silence. Some survivors described hearing a sound before they were hurled off their feet, a pressure wave so violent it crushed lungs and ruptured eardrums. Others wandered the rubble half-blind, unable to hear their own cries. In homes, people were pinned beneath broken furniture and lacerated by window glass, their loved ones clawing at plaster and concrete to free them. On the streets, people staggered like ghosts, caught in a waking nightmare they couldn't escape. The human damage was not just trauma, it was anatomy turned into aftermath. Burns, blunt force injuries, dismemberment, and the unfathomable knowledge that for some, the blast was their last breath. These were not abstract casualties. They were shopkeepers, students, dock workers, nurses, turned to ash and silence in an instant. In a downtown apartment, Noor, a young medical student, was reviewing notes when her windows imploded inward. She doesn't remember the sound, only the silence afterward. She stumbled to her feet, the world around her blurred by dust and glass, and looked out upon something she couldn't comprehend. The skyline was gone, she said. It was as if a black hole had sucked the heart out of Beirut. At the port, firefighter Sahar Fares and her team had been dispatched to Warehouse 12, just minutes before the detonation. They had no idea what lay inside. Cell phone footage later recovered showed Sahar in full gear, standing by the flames, waiting for a signal to enter. She never got the chance. The footage ends in a searing flash. Her body was never fully recovered. Closer to the blast site at the Karantina Hospital, Nurse Elias was mid-shift, tending to a patient with a high fever. He remembers a sudden rumble, low and deep, like a train approaching underground, and then everything turned white. He awoke moments later under a collapsed ceiling. Half the hospital was gone, its emergency ward flattened, dozens buried beneath twisted metal and broken tiles. Nearby, in the upscale Gemese district, once a haven for cafes, art studios and wine bars, Chef Rami was prepping a tray of pastries. His shop was known for its cheerful decor and lavender espresso. In seconds, it turned into a slaughterhouse. At least 218 people would lose their lives that day. More than 7,000 were injured. But the emotional wounds ran even deeper. Myrna, a schoolteacher who lived in a modest apartment facing the port, lost her eyesight when flying debris lacerated her face. Her son survived with minor bruises. Among the more haunting stories is that of Dr. Imad, a pathologist who helped identify the dead. There were so many bodies we couldn't piece back together, he recalled. Some came in burnt, others in bags with pieces missing. Children, mothers, port workers. I couldn't stop seeing their faces, he said. The explosion obliterated not just buildings, but lives mid-action. Phone calls interrupted, meals half-eaten, text messages forever unsent. There was no warning, no sirens, just a light rumble, and then apocalypse. In the hours following the blast, Beirut was plunged into chaos. Emergency responders dug through rubble with bare hands. Citizens wrapped wounds in curtains and tablecloths. The dead were covered in bedsheets and left on sidewalks until morgues could take them. Hospitals, already strained by the pandemic, were overwhelmed. In some cases, injured patients were treated by candlelight. And yet, in the carnage, there was courage. Volunteers, many of them survivors themselves, formed human chains to move bricks, reconnected gas lines, and delivered food to the elderly. Strangers offered rides to the wounded. Shop owners gave away supplies. Families took in the newly homeless. A city shattered, but not silenced. For every statistic, there's a voice. Someone who watched their world fall apart and kept going. These are the voices in the ashes, and their stories deserve to be heard. The Beirut explosion wasn't an accident in the traditional sense. It was a tragedy crafted over years, slowly, invisibly, and with chilling negligence. To understand how an entire capital city could be crippled in seconds, we must dissect the perfect storm of bureaucratic paralysis, mismanagement, and a powder keg left to rot in the heart of Lebanon. It began with the 2,750 metric tons of ammonium nitrate, left by the MV Rosus. This highly explosive chemical compound, once seized, was moved to the now infamous Warehouse 12, a storage hangar at the port, and that's where it sat, for 7 years. 7 years, no safety protocols, no relocation, and no consistent oversight. It was left amid jugs of oil, fuel, and fireworks, an improvised bomb, just counting down. Warnings came, again and again. Officials were petitioned to move the material. Port authorities were informed. Customs officers pleaded with the government. One even wrote, "This cargo is a floating bomb." But in a system rusted with corruption and bureaucracy, urgency died in paperwork. No one wanted to claim responsibility, so nothing was done. The warehouse was not just poorly monitored, it was actively dangerous. The building was structurally compromised, lacking ventilation, fire suppression systems, or even proper signage. People came and went, unaware that behind the corrugated walls sat a substance that had already caused deadly explosions in other parts of the world, like the 2015 Tianjin blast in China. On that morning, on August 4th, 2020, welders were called in to seal off a hole in the wall of the warehouse. It was a routine repair. Sparks likely ignited nearby materials, initially fireworks stored illegally. As flames climbed the interior walls, they reached the stacks of ammonium nitrate. A fiery chain reaction took hold. The result was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in recorded history. The blast's energy was equivalent to a magnitude 3.3 earthquake. A pressure wave traveled at supersonic speed. The mushroom cloud climbed over 300 meters into the sky, and windows shattered more than 10 kilometers away. In an instant, years of criminal negligence were exposed, written across the faces of the dead and the skyline of a wounded city. This was not a case of bad luck. It was systematic failure. Lebanon's political structure, a web of sectarian power sharing and institutional gridlock, meant decisions were rarely made quickly or effectively. Corruption and cronyism ran deep. Officials were rarely held accountable. In the days after the explosion, investigations began and arrests were made. But the officials blamed one another. Still, the deeper issue remained. A culture where impunity is normalized, where corners are cut, and where public safety is sacrificed for short-term convenience. For the survivors, the horror wasn't just the moment of detonation. It was the unbearable truth that this didn't have to happen. Even the emergency response revealed systemic flaws. Hospitals were underfunded, fire crews lacked proper equipment, and no mass casualty plan had ever been implemented. When Beirut needed its systems to work, they collapsed. In the months that followed, Lebanon entered a deeper political and economic crisis. Protests surged. Demands for accountability grew. But many feared, as always, the truth would be buried like the debris under the port's rubble. The explosion in Beirut was over in seconds, but the scars it left on bodies, on buildings, on the soul of a nation will linger for generations. From a distance, the blast looked like something out of a war zone. A towering cloud, dust and debris sweeping across the harbor, a city recoiling in stunned silence. What makes this story so deeply horrifying is not just the destruction, it's the betrayal. When the smoke cleared, it didn't just reveal rubble and glass. It revealed the ugly truth that the real danger had always been inside the system meant to protect them. To this day, the exact chain of accountability remains murky. Investigations have stalled. Whistleblowers face pressure. Survivors wait for justice. Meanwhile, the crater at the port still gapes like a wound that refuses to close. And yet, there is resilience. The same city that was shattered also rose. In the weeks after the explosion, volunteers swarmed the streets with brooms, buckets, and bandages. Artists painted murals on walls blown open by shockwaves. Families hung photos of the missing on charred buildings, not as surrender, but as defiance, a cry that said, "We remember, we saw, we will not forget." For those drawn to true tales of horror, it's tempting to view this story as one final, brutal chapter. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The story of Beirut's blast is ongoing. Its lessons about complacency, about corruption, about the terrifying consequences of neglect are universal. And they demand more than pity. They demand memory. Because what happened on August 4th, 2020 is not just Lebanon's cautionary tale. It's a warning for every nation, every system, and every leader who ignores the cracks forming underfoot. As we tell their story, let it be a record, a reckoning, a reminder that the line between safety and catastrophe is thinner than we dare to believe. For more fascinating horror, hit the like button and subscribe.